Okay, now we're live.
Okay. Aloha and welcome to the first episode of Inside the Historian's Office. Hi, I'm Daniel Martinez, Chief Historian here at World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument, and anxious to get our first program on, one of many we hope to come in the next year. We'll probably try to do it every 2 months, so welcome. My first question came from Jared Ferrato. I hope I have that pronounced right. He noted in the commentary of the director's cut of Pearl Harbor by Michael Bay and Walt Disney Productions that I had considered in the critique of the film that we had reached the essence of Pearl Harbor. And the question that came up was, what did I mean by essence, I think was the question. And I think that that's a fair question. Working on the production and seeing the film, those were very interesting times. And, most of the Pearl Harbor films that have been made have been actually filmed in Hawaii, and Pearl Harbor was no different. I mentioned the essence because it talked about youth, it talked about sacrifice, it talked about death, and it showed the magnitude of the attack, even though it was almost purely fictional. So that essence I was talking about is the emotions that it evoked with the loss of life and the dedication to duty by some, the drowning of sailors aboard the battleships, the attacks on the airfields. It was that essence of it. Although, as I often say, the only two things right about Pearl Harbor is it did happen on December 7th, 1941, and it was at Pearl Harbor, but that was about it. But what happened with that film, and I've had this actually happen in real life, that it attracted young people, and they watched it, and then they wanted to come to Pearl Harbor, and we had droves of teenagers and young college students coming here to see this place and that they had seen in the movie. And that gave us a great opportunity to tell the right story, the true story of what happened at Pearl Harbor. It also opened up something that we weren't expecting. The Pearl Harbor survivors, which were in their 80s at that time, thought that they had been forgotten by that generation. And when they started seeing these young people coming and wanting to meet with them, have a picture with them, get an autograph, some of them were moved to tears because they just simply thought that generation didn't care. A young student named Amanda Corona fell in love with the film and wanted to be at Pearl Harbor, which led to her being here as a volunteer for part of a summer, and then later as a National Park Service Ranger, staff historian, working with me, and then got very fortunate and met a nice guy and has a family and worked at the USS Midway and probably watching this right now. So yeah, some really good things did come out of a bad history, but it did, in my view, capture the essence of the meaning of Pearl Harbor, and it galvanized a whole group of young people to come visit. Ted Sakiyama, I understand that it wasn't until decades after the attack that the guns in number 1 turret were found still on the Arizona. Is that true? And what's your best take on how they were overlooked so many years? Well, they really weren't. When the Navy worked on the salvage of the USS Arizona and its assessment if it could be salvaged and put back into the fleet, it made a series of studies of the Arizona and found out that her back was broken by the explosion, that the damage was just so horrific that she would never fight again. So they removed the guns from the battleship, and they did that to simply make coastal fortifications of them and gun emplacements, and respectively Battery Arizona was on the Eva side of the island, and Battery Pennsylvania was at Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station on the hilltop above it. So you had these guns removed for that reason. Functionally, only Battery Pennsylvania ever actually fired. The other one was not completed. Gun barrels from number 2 turret were removed and used later in the fleet. And then gun turret number 1, which had fallen 26 feet from its mountings down into the ship, was noted by everyone that was working on it. But as years pass by and people retire and move on, when the National Park Service came here in 1980, we had no idea what was down there. And so Superintendent Cummins at that point wanted to put together a dive team and find out what's down there. And when the National Park Service divers went over the ship, they went towards the bow, and they were surprised to discover the gun turret was still there and the gun barrels, and so it was rediscovered. So you think about that. When the National Park Service took over, the Pearl Harbor attack had already passed 35 years. So that history had been lost and rediscovered by the National Park Service, which now still conducts a very healthy dive program led by our museum curator, Scott Pawlowski, and has regular dive teams that inventory artifacts on the ship, look at the condition of the ship, measure the oil leaking from the ship, a series of studies of the ship itself. So your question was a really good one because it led to these other explanations that I'd like to talk about. There's a new book out on the underwater photographs that are just breathtaking and came out this year on the 75th anniversary. And if you go to not the National Park Service, but our National Park Service Association, which is Pacific Historic Parks, you can get that. It is probably one of the most breathtaking documentation of the ship. A lot of photos by Brett Seymour, another National Park Service diver, and many of us that have worked on the vessel in a variety of professional occupations wrote about it, and you can read our stories in there along with these great photographs. So there's my plug for the underwater book. But I really would tell you, if you're into Pearl Harbor and you don't have that book, you're missing out. So I would really recommend that. The next question from Tom, I'll take one more from Tom. I believe in the 2006 symposium there was a talk that the battleships in Pearl Harbor were painted some shade of blue rather than the common gray. Is that now accepted, and can tell us what shade of blue is? Well, that's getting down into the what we call the bullets and buttons part of the history, but it's a very important one because the Pacific Fleet was ordered to get into war colors for the growing tensions that were happening in the Pacific. The color on the battleships was a sea blue, so it's sort of like a dark gray with a blue tint to it. And so there was an order that was given by Admiral Kimmel, and we're going to be putting photographs and that order up on the Pacific Historic Parks website, and also on the National Park Service website. So you can go and check it out and see how this information came to be. And by the way, it was investigated by, and I'm going to forget his name, but the curator of ship models who actually built the model of the Arizona, and I'll think of his name in a moment, but he did the research, found it in the National Archives. It had been hidden history, but we were starting to see that the ship's colors were not coming through as you would think, but the shades of gray were not the light gray, they were dark. And later we found some color photographs that verified that they were sea blue. So that was the idea. The tops of the battleships were light gray, so the sea blue was meant to blend in with the sea and the light gray with the horizon or sky, and that way it would camouflage and confuse the enemy as to what type of ship it was. So that was done for a purpose. Battleship divisions had their turrets painted a variety of different colors depending on the division. That also had stirred some controversy among model makers. They had thought they had made the ultimate Arizona model. They had the wrong color and not the turrets painted. But those are all information that will be up on the website. So if you're interested in that, you'll be able to see that. And we'll try to get that up within the next 3 weeks. Another question coming forward here is from Stephen Roosevelt. When will the USS Utah Memorial be open to the general public? Well, that's another great question. We have within our mandate as World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument promise to work towards getting transportation to visit not only the USS Utah Memorial, but the USS Oklahoma Memorial, and some related sites that are on Ford Island, historical sites related to the Pearl Harbor attack. And so a transportation plan is part of the study that needs to be done to see how that could actually transpire. And it's certainly on our agenda, but there are many agendas, and one of the things that we know is how will we fund that, and what kind of transportation needs to be done. So a study will be put forward to do that. I can't tell you when that's going to take place, but it is something we talk about, and we know it's important to get to these sites and to see the only other ship that's here from Pearl Harbor, the USS Utah, is important. And it's under National Park Service, not sponsorship, but ownership, and also the USS Oklahoma. So we hope to get that resolved. That's a big project, but I can envision how that would occur, and getting people over there and having interpretation of the sites unfold at historic Ford Island. So it's something that's really worthy. Paul Traeger said, during your tenure as chief historian, what has been the most amazing discovery, and how did it alter existing perceptions of the events that unfold on December 7th? Wow. Paul, I would say that for me in 1991, when a torpedo that failed, but was part of the Japanese torpedo assault on Battleship Row, was discovered as a result of a dredging operation, myself and Bob Chenoweth, who was the curator at that time, were called upon to go look at it and try to verify, was it really a Japanese torpedo? The Navy have a team called EOD, and they're explosive experts, and they had it on a flat barge, and we rushed out to look at it. And in fact, when you come to the museum, you can see half of the torpedo because they had to explode part of it to make it safe. But there's pictures of us gathered around the torpedo, and that was a much younger version of me in May of 1991. But that was so unbelievable to have an artifact, because 40 torpedo planes were used in the attack, and they attacked both sides of Ford Island, and there were very few failures. And this one, we were able to find the history from the Japanese perspective of one of the torpedo planes that got in trouble. It was taking fire, and the aircraft had to maneuver away from that fire, and in the process released the torpedo too high, and it hit the water at a high angle and went into the mud, and then the motor continued to move. Well, we actually have a photograph taken during the time of Battleship Row, and you can see that concentric circle there, and we know that it's not a bomb that landed there, because no bombing was taking place. That comes a few minutes later, but it's the torpedo running, and that's exactly where it was discovered by the dredge. Kind of interesting, when the dredge operator pulled it up, he had it in the scissors of the shovel, and it had it right by the warhead. And that's when his life passed before him, because as he banged it up against a mooring quay, the mud dropped away, and he could see the fins and the propeller from the torpedo. And he left his station and then notified the Navy that he had pulled up a torpedo, not knowing it was from December 7th, 1941, but it's in our museum. And so that was one of the most amazing discoveries. And to actually go out there and touch it and then rub away the cartouche, because Bob brought all of the identification books, and the Japanese cartouche said the year Showa. The year Showa is 1941. So we were excited, and still get excited even talking about it. Great stuff. So you can see it right here at the museum. Let me see. Madeline Peaster. This is one of these things that the questions I love. This is one I don't know. And she asked, can you show the house on Ford Island that was hit by a bomb that didn't explode? I don't know of any bomb that didn't explode. So I'm going to ask Madeline to contact us and let me know that, because that's one of the stories that I've never heard. Some of the bombs were not aimed at the houses. They were aimed at Battleship Row. We had some fall short right near the CPO bungalows, so I would like to find out which bomb that was and what's the story behind it and who witnessed it. Miss Anami, Iki, I guess, Anami, how much of the USS Arizona was cut off, and why don't they display what is left? Well, that's a good question. In 1960-61, when they were preparing to build the USS Arizona Memorial, a section that was there that was left was the boat deck, and that's where the initial memorial platform was built by Admiral Radford. And it's my feeling that by having that platform there and Admiral Radford having a flag raised each morning and taken down each sunset, it perpetuated the story of the USS Arizona, its sacrifice. And so people were galvanized to say, we should have a real memorial, and what would that be? And so in order for the USS Arizona Memorial you see today to be constructed, because it's a suspension bridge, that piece of wreckage was way too close, would be way too close to the memorial and get in the way of the construction. So they cut away the boat deck. Try to imagine your house, and you went to the halfway point in your house and then cut that all off and lifted it off. That's exactly what they did. And then they took that wreckage to Waipio Peninsula and then placed it there, and it's been there ever since 1961. So that wreckage is still there. Some of that wreckage has been given to museums and places that will take care of it. The National World War II Museum has a piece of that Arizona. The museum in Japan, the only museum in Japan that has a piece of the Arizona, is at Ritsumeikan University. So these pieces of relics that went out used to go to Pearl Harbor survivors that requested them, no longer. But the Navy now dispenses that wreckage and is looking for museums that want more pieces because they're willing to make sure they get them. So the Arizona becomes that symbol that's reflective of 9/11, where a number of pieces of the towers have been placed in museums and parks and things as a vivid reminder of that day and a place of remembrance and sacrifice. And that's very true with the USS Arizona wreckage. Frank Tesaro, where is the remaining superstructure of the Arizona? Well, I just answered that. But the other question, he says, are there any recent pictures of what is left? And I just was out there, and I have some pictures, and we'll be putting those pictures up on the PHP website, so Pacific Historic's website. So we'll get those up. I have to just send them to Elaine, who's our camera person right now, and she's smiling because I'm giving her more work to do. But we'll get those up because I just took several photos of the wreckage today, so you'll get an idea what that's like. Bob McDermott. Oh, Representative McDermott. I know this guy. And he was also president of the Navy League here in Hawaii. So this is his loaded question, because he's a politician. He says, how was your tour with POTUS? But he didn't say which POTUS. So let's see. Why don't we go over how many, so I don't show any favoritism towards anyone, because we're very apolitical. I have had the pleasure of meeting 5 presidents. My first president that I met was simply a handshake and how are you, sir? And that was him coming off the USS Missouri in 1991 during the 50th anniversary. He gave 4 speeches that day. He gave a speech at Punch Bowl for the sunrise service. There were just hundreds of Pearl Harbor survivors there. Then he gave the second speech at the USS Arizona Memorial at 8 o'clock that morning. He gave his third speech, which was very short, on the USS Missouri, which was active duty at the time. And he gave his fourth speech at the Navy Pier that I'm trying to think of the pier, but it was a very large warehouse building, and he talked to the Pearl Harbor survivors and probably gave the greatest speech, in my view, of his presidency. And it was a speech, and you should look it up, I have no rancor in my heart towards Germany or Japan. It was a message of reconciliation to the Pearl Harbor survivors that we have now been at peace with our former enemy for 45 years. And so it was a chance to move on. And his words were carefully selected and one of the truly great Pearl Harbor speeches that were given. The next president that I met was Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, who came here to, by the way, Barbara Bush was with the president. I didn't get a chance to meet her, but she was there. And then the Clintons had come, President Clinton had come here for the 50th anniversary of the ending of World War II, which was really special as well, because instead of having a dais of the White House staff and the cabinet and the Joint Chiefs and all of that, he asked that all of them spread themselves among the veterans and not sit in a group, but sit among the veterans. And so it was really great because my parents were there for that, and they sat right next to Leon Panetta, who was the Chief of Staff of the White House. So it was quite a thrill that they were among the veterans there. And 3 Medal of Honor recipients were up with the president, and one of them was John Finn, the very famous John Finn from Kaneohe Bay. And in his enthusiasm of throwing a wreath over, he almost fell overboard himself, but it wouldn't have been caught in the net, but it was an anxious moment. So that was a great visit. And then we had George W. Bush here, and he came for a visit to the memorial, and just had a brief meeting with him on the memorial, and he was primarily there to meet the Pearl Harbor survivors, which were gathered, and some other groups on the memorial. So that was not a December 7th day, but just a presidential visit. And then President Obama came here, but I first had a chance to meet him on a visit when he was running for president. He came here, and so he made a visit to the USS Arizona Memorial, and along with my colleague, a chief of interpretation, Eileen Martinez, we were the ones to greet the senator and his family. And then the next time I saw then Senator Obama, President Obama, he came here just recently to be part of the reconciliation ceremony with the visit of Prime Minister Abe, which was captured on TV. It was quite a moment. It's often interesting to be able to read history, but to actually witness it, and that was so historic. What happened was quite a privilege, and we were on the Admiral's barge and had a chance to talk with the president and share some stories, along with Ambassador Carolyn Kennedy, who I reminded the president that the first president to visit the memorial was President John F. Kennedy in the late months of 1963. And just a few months later, the tragedy in Dallas would take place. But that was a special moment for history with the two countries. One visit to Hiroshima, then followed by the joint visit again of these two leaders at Pearl Harbor at the USS Arizona Memorial. And currently, just recently, we had the POTUS from our new president. President Trump was here, and he was here with the First Lady and General Kelly and his and the other staff members that traveled with him. So this was the opening leg of the trip, a 10-day trip to Asia, which just currently concluded. And so that was also an interesting visit of a person who had never visited the USS Arizona Memorial. And so he was very interested in its history and asked a lot of questions, was interested in the oil, interested in the crisis that brought about the attack. And so it was always great when you have somebody asking questions, because it's always awkward as to what do you say to the commander-in-chief that is there. And so it was great. Of course, the admiral was always alongside and always gracious, and so it was a longer visit than we anticipated. We were on the water and at the memorial over a span of time that was one of the longest visits of chief executive to the memorial. So it turned out to be very informative for all of us, because you always learn something about a visit of the chief executive and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and certainly the visit of Mr. Trump to the memorial was one of a great exchange and a lot of good questions.
Okay, the next question is, the 3D model made by Autodesk of the underwater scan, will a model be available, or 3D model?
That's really interesting, too. The 3D model, we have discussed the idea of having a 12 or 14-inch model made. Now, how these models are made is they're literally all carved via the computer. And so one of the things that we're going to explore is whether the Association Pacific Historic Parks would like to sell a model of that. It would be the most detailed model you could have, and so interesting, because if you had it at 12 to 14 inches, it's big enough that it could be used in classrooms or just be nice, something nice to study. But we have thought about it, and we'd like to move that forward. So thank you for that question.
Okay, the next question is, any thoughts for preservation of the Arizona?
Well, I wish Scott was here. He's one of the best, but Scott's told me a lot about what's going on with the ship. And what's going on with the ship is that she's in the ideal conditions for preservation. Let me explain why. First of all, the Pearl Harbor is like a large lake. It's very calm. There's no waters that are strong enough to do her damage here. Of course, we have an occasional storm, but that's one of the things that preserves her. The other part of it is the biogrowth on the Arizona, which surrounds it, actually expels oxygen away from the metal, so the biogrowth friendly. We did have a study that when I was diving on the Arizona, I participated in, and every 12 feet we went down and we did a coring of the metal, literally removed a core of the metal, and the scientists and scientists and professors from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, what they did is they took those core samples and then looked at the rate of deterioration. And they found, as we went deeper down into the ship, because the ship rests in 23 feet of mud and 45 to 50 feet of water, that the rate of preservation was extremely high once we got down about 20 feet, and then it just increased. So the mud and the lower oxygen in those areas has led to the strong preservation of the ship, which some of the estimates, which are simply estimates of anywhere from 600 to 800 years that the ship will last. And so these conditions are very favorable, and we continue to study the ship, study its rate of deterioration. Since I've been here, I've seen the deck, the upper decks closest to the surface of the water, deteriorate. But as you go down further, there is not that rate of deterioration. So it's all about the oxygen levels and depth. And obviously there's more scientific studies than that, but the other study we do is the rate of oil coming out of the ship, which is about 2 to 3 quarts a day. A droplet coming up every 20 to 30 seconds, about the size of a gumball. And so that's another question we get. And we keep an eye on it, but at that rate it doesn't pose any environmental problem per se. But it's part of kind of the messaging to some people of the blood of the ship or the tears of the ship. And to the Arizona survivors, that oil is just a constant reminder of the loss of the vessel. And the oil you smell or see out there today is the same oil and smell of December 7th, 1941. So it's a powerful place to visit, and knowing that over 900 men are still entombed in the ship, you can see the ship from really 3 different levels, as a shipwreck, as a tomb, and now with the biogrowth on the ship, she's a reef and has new life with green sea turtles living on it and a variety of species of fish, the return of corals and different types of underwater vegetation that makes it look like a sarcophagus of jewels, as Alfred Price once called it. And he was the architect of the USS Arizona Memorial.
Okay, the next question is, has PHP or NPS ever done a traveling exhibit of Pearl Harbor artifacts for those who can't make it to Hawaii?
We exchanged some artifacts during the 50th anniversary, but no, we haven't really engaged in a traveling exhibit of our artifacts to other museums, and it's certainly something that should be considered, so it's a great suggestion.
Amanda asks, what is your favorite memory after working there for so long?
Favorite memory? I think one of my favorite memories goes to the 50th anniversary, and seeing all of the USS Arizona survivors and Pearl Harbor survivors gathered here in the thousands, and to meet for me, just meeting someone that was on the USS Arizona was so special. And meeting the African American mess attendants, which I had never had an opportunity to meet one, and became friends with one that was off the USS Utah. Meeting John Finn, the Medal of Honor recipient. It was just that whole moment. It was like a historian's Disneyland. It just one day after another of honor and tribute. We had the symposium then. Maybe that's hard to say, but I'll tell you, one of the things that I was most gratified with and happy was that during the symposium we had all the radar operators there. And we had Elliott and Lockhart, and we had the gentleman that took the message at the alert center. I'm trying to think of his name. I just lost it, but the one that said, "Don't worry about it." And so I'll think of it in a moment. And then Tetley, who was the officer in charge of the air warning system of radar, was there. That was really something. And I remember we drove up to the actual site at Opana, and I'm driving the van up, and I've got Tetley, and I've got Elliott Lockhart, and why can't I think of the name? Amanda, send me the name. So it just went brain dead. Kermit Tyler. And so Kermit Tyler was there, and I turned back to him and I said, "Gosh, it's so great. All of you guys are here. What is it like to be reunited?" And they all turned to each other and says, "We never met." So I just assumed they had met, and the only ones that knew each other were Elliott Lockhart. They had never met Kermit Tyler, and they had not seen Tetley in years. So I pulled the van over on the way up and got out and showed them where we were going, the website, and I says, "By the way, you guys should shake hands and meet each other." So that was really special. And of course, now you're really triggering stuff, because actually meeting Japanese aviators, Zenjei Abe, who later would become my adopted Japanese grandfather, the first pilot to really extend his hand in reconciliation, friendship on the Today Show months before the anniversary. These are all like memories that come back. And so I would say overall the 50th anniversary of 1991 was something I'll never forget, and I should write about it. But that was my favorite memory. That does not, and not meant to supersede the other ones, because every anniversary has been special, but that was a moment.
Okay, the next question is, did the Japanese know that the Utah was at its birth at the time of the attack?
Yeah, the question always comes up about the Utah, and there's a lot of mythology about this ship, and I've seen it written in books, which is kind of disturbing. But there's one that is popular, that the Japanese attacked it because they thought it was an aircraft carrier because it had wooden planks that were on its deck, and but they failed to tell you that it had turrets on its deck. It had a mainmast, and it looked just like a battleship. The Japanese approached Pearl Harbor to attack berthing areas where ships were. And so to them, when those two torpedoes, the first torpedo hits were on the Utah, when they smashed into the Utah, they thought they were attacking a warship. And no one knew it was a training ship. All of this stuff comes out later, and it's part of the mythology of Pearl Harbor. So, and in the case of one berthing area being not occupied, that plane skipped over Ford Island and dropped its torpedo against a cruiser, Helena. So the Japanese were after targets that were in berthing areas, and that's how they carried out the attack. The mythology about the Utah, something that prevails in books but is not reality.
This question is, did they save the after tripod that wasn't damaged during the attack saved?
Well, not on the Arizona, but on the USS California they did, and they saved it, and they made it a observation signal tower in the yard. It was actually placed over on Kahoahoa Island, and that's right near the southeast lock. So it was, it was used, but it was the California, not the Arizona. That was all cut up for scrap and sent back to the mainland.
Nikki Stratton asks, any plans to bring back the Donald Stratton action figure? That's something I would like to see.
Yeah, we were recently talking about to Pacific Historic Parks about the idea of bringing back the kind of products that were unique, developed by the Arizona Memorial Museum Association, later PHP. So there's some discussion being done about bringing back the action figures and making some other action figures of heroes of Pearl Harbor. So we sold those figures pretty steadily, and they were unique. You could only buy them here.
The next question is, can you address the progress being made on the work being done on the USS Missouri? The USS Missouri is undergoing some pretty extensive repairs to her superstructure. One of the things that's being done is they're grinding off the old paint, and that's why they have it shrouded, because it has lead. And so they have to make sure none of that gets into the air, and so it's completely enclosed. Other is ships rust, and that has to be repaired. So this is an extensive job, and I'm not sure, but you could go to the website for the USS Missouri Memorial Museum. Oh God, I'm stuck on the memorial. USS Missouri Memorial Museum, and there should be information on their website about that, and you can read more about it at their website. The next one is, are you going back into the Arizona with the ROV to explore the lower decks into the Arizona 2.0 on PBS?
Well, we recently did that, and it was quite interesting to see what we could see down there, and especially the uniforms still hanging, and some of the spaces just as they were in many ways, and to see what time has done to them. That would be a question I'd have to ask Scott Pulowski if they plan on doing that. But we've been doing that over a period of years. I was here for some of the first dives that were done in 1985 and 86. There was some previous ones before that. But that whole extensive dive program, which is in a book that we sell, an official book on the underwater study of the USS Arizona, is there, because we also did that for the USS Utah. We also discussed, aircraft and torpedoes. We looked for crashed airplanes and actually found remnants of pieces of some, but we never went back to do more. And there's also ordnance in the harbor as well from the Pearl Harbor attack. So there's a variety of opportunities. It's a question of what is the priority and who sets those priorities, and how we move forward in our underwater archaeology.
This question is, are the inner parts of the ship, the Arizona, intact?
Well, the spaces that we've been into is where we have the opportunity to go in because the hatches are open and we can go through there. There is no way for us to go towards midships in the lower decks and see what's there. Our opportunity to see the ship is primarily in the quarterdeck section of the vessel, so that's the aft section of the vessel. So that would be a great question for Scott to answer, but I had, if all of the Arizona was alive for about 11 minutes once General Quarters was announced and the sirens went off. So they had then time to button up the ship and put her into her battle conditions, and that was making sure all the compartments were closed. So there may be somewhere a compartment that's closed that's intact, but what we see are compartments, some of them intact because the uniforms are in them, but not compartments that are closed. We see the ones that are open.
Cassidy Newkirk says, what has the reaction been to the 8x6 oil painting in the theater been? Has it been able to preserve, teach, and inspire the story further so far? Is it still holding its condition as a painting?
Yeah, the painting is holding up. The challenge with the painting is it's so dark it's difficult to see. So we're looking at some lighting options for it, but it's really dark and it's very, very difficult to see the detail. It's hanging in the theater so 150 guests can see it every half hour. But right now, because it's very large, a question will arise as how do we properly light that so that the detail can be seen. But basically, it's a very, very dark painting, primarily with very dark colors. So there's a real challenge there in seeing it. In sunlight, yes, but it needs to be protected and it's large. So we have to look at that. And it's something we would like to discuss with the artist.
The next one is there any chance of getting a model of the memorial released?
Well, yeah, we had those. In years past, we had one produced in plastic, and it came in a commemorative box, and it was a hot seller for us. We can certainly talk to PHP and see if they're interested in doing that. We do. I know the sales representatives there do get questions periodically, do you have a model of the memorial? And so we can bring this up and see if that can go forward.
Does it bother or affect you in any way as to how some of the Japanese people act while on board the memorial?
Well, that's a interesting question. All the times I've been out there with Japanese guests or when I was working as a park ranger, I had no problem with Japanese visitors being disrespectful. However, some people cannot sometimes delineate other Asians, and so one of the primary challenges we've had is with Chinese guests, and that's not generally their fault because the guides don't properly inform them where they're going, and so some of the behavior which has been loud or disruptive on the memorial, not all, but in some cases, has been with some of our Chinese guests, and we have worked hard on that. It occasionally rises, but from time to time, and it's brought to our attention, and so we try to work very closely with the tour companies and make sure that the guides properly inform them that they're going to a cemetery-like site and that quiet is required, and a behavior also has to be at a place of reverence at that site. So it's always a challenge. I've been to other places and I've seen Americans not understand where they are at a place of real special importance to the country that it's in, and I've seen that when I was in Europe on tour. So this is a more of a universal problem, I think, and that has to do with not understanding the site, the cultural site that you're visiting. And so that's the respect for another country's sacred site is very, very important, and we certainly here are attuned to make sure that the utmost respect is brought about. But it is, up to the individuals that come, whether they be the guides for the tour companies or Americans that come here, that sometimes people are concerned about the state of dress of people that are visiting the memorial. These are all the challenges of what visiting a memorial is like, and also what the obligations of an individual is on their own merit as to what respect that they extend when they're visiting a place like the USS Arizona Memorial.
Eric Kilgore says, can you think of a certain story of an Arizona crewman that stands out as particularly touching since you've researched the official military personnel record?
Oh, I think I wrote about it. I mean, I've always been in awe of any of the Arizona survivors, but I was running across letters that were not from the survivors. These were from the families of those that were killed aboard Arizona. And I wrote a piece for a magazine, and it was called A Suitable Memorial. And as I was going through the scanning process for this collection over the last 2 years with our team of really skilled people, and one of my project managers was Mike Winger, and now a new one, Tom Reese, and both were enthralled by and just stunned, because it was so emotional to read these letters for the first time of a mother who simply was writing the president and asking that a suitable memorial be built for her son. So, I saw that, and I was just emotionally moved by it and felt I had to write about it. And in the long run, that suitable memorial was built, and it's the USS Arizona Memorial. So it is for me an emotional roller coaster, and I can be just fine, and then I think about them and I start to lose it. And because I've been fortunate to have been here since the summer of 1985, and so I've met almost all the Arizona survivors, and I was watching a video of This Is Your Life, and it was about the Arizona and the senior surviving officer, and there was a man that was on there, and I had forgotten he was on. His name was Wenslav, and he was one of the men that I returned to the Arizona as part of a team that does that. And so it just gets you that you knew them in life, and now you know them as they have passed from this generation. And that finality of the World War II generation is, right on the horizon right now. And so we've been very fortunate, I have, and others that have worked here, to know these men and their families, and in particular the personal privilege of being part of a project that scanned every record of those killed aboard Arizona, and seeing these letters from these families, and knowing that the first contact after Pearl Harbor that they got, because they didn't know what happened to everybody, they were getting missing in action, and how cruel that was. And it wasn't intended to be cruel, but missing in action meant hope that he would be found, the husband, the brother, the son.
Okay, Randy Stratton says, can you tell the story of Joe George and the 6 men he saved?
Well, Joe George was a bosun's mate, I think second class or first class, but regardless, he was aboard the USS Vestal, which was moored right next to the USS Arizona, and just recently saw the deck log for the Vestal, some information I didn't even know existed. And now I know exactly when the USS Arizona pulled into the mooring quays at Foxtrot 7, and I know exactly what time the Vestal pulled along, and that the captain didn't pull it in, but an actual pilot was brought aboard. It was a very delicate thing to go up next to a battleship, as you can imagine. And you run across this individual who was sent back to the aft section of the Vestal. While the attack was going on, the Arizona exploded. From the deck log, I found out that pieces of the Arizona rained down on the Vestal. Fires were ignited on the Vestal from the explosion. So you can imagine the captain, Cassin Young, having to deal with this crisis, and the fire so intense it's blistering the paint on the starboard side, or port side, port side of the ship. And this bosun's mate sent down to cut the line so they can pull away. They're taking water. They've been holed by a bomb, and sees these individuals hailing them from the foremast of the Arizona on the port side gun director, and it happens to be Donald Stratton, just a kid, 17 at the time, and 5 others who are going to be burned alive. And so instead of cutting those lines, he goes and finds a heaving line and throws this, what is called a monkey fist. It's a hard, almost like a hard ball, and throws it 70 feet and gets it up to him with one throw. And they're going to use, then they pull the heavier line over, tie it off, and that heavier line is where these 6 men are going to go across hand over hand over to the Vestal. If Joe George does not do that, Don Stratton and the other 5 men don't survive. They'll be burned to death. And as it was, they were burned, many of them already, and with those burns, they had to go over the ship, and they were being burned as they left the burning Arizona below them. If there's ever a miracle that unfolded at Pearl Harbor, there was probably 2 at Pearl Harbor: the escape of the Oklahoma men who found a way out to get out the bottom of the ship and get to surface, and it's the men of the Arizona. And so without Joe George doing that, they don't survive, and it is what they call uncommon valor. And in doing so, he saved those lives. And so I found at the National Archives, in the Cassin Young's service jacket, a note about Joe George, and it said that he should have a commendation. And I don't know if that commendation was given, but I think it's time that the country recognize that valor and what he did to save those men. And so we can't lobby for that, but as a historian, I'm just simply saying that history bears witness to that heroism and the fact that he saved 6 men's lives. I think it's time to review that.
Okay, we have more questions, or do you want to?
We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And then we want you to return, and we'll give you the next date here. When will we post that?
Oh, this will post now.
I mean the next date.
Oh, like in 2 months.
Okay, we're going to do it in 2 months. So in 2018 we'll be back. What's the question?
Did any of the several torpedoes that hit USS Oklahoma hit near the Marines' berthing, and where was it located on board?
That's one thing I don't know. The damage to the you have to know the inside of the ship. I know the inside of the Arizona. I know where the Marines there. That's not always the same because they were different vessels. They were battleships, but they were different. And so I can't answer that question. But the torpedoes that hit the Oklahoma were extensive. And of all the ships that were struck by torpedoes, she received the most. We'll never know the exact number. There's just, anywhere from 8 to 11. We know torpedoes followed torpedo holes. And these holes were massive. That when a torpedo exploded on the side of a ship, you could drive a Mack truck through it. And so the other torpedoes that followed and did further damage. So the Oklahoma had damage that went all the way midway into the ship. Not only that, as she was capsizing, she got a torpedo that went into her deck. So John DiVirgilio, who is one of the Pearl Harbor historians of note, like Mike Winger, did a study on the torpedo attack on Battleship Row. and he did some extensive work at looking at the salvage photos and actually making drawings of the ship itself and it under attack and where the damage was from the torpedoes. So there is a lot out there. So if you're interested in that, just Google John DiVirgilio. His reports are there. They're also were published in the Naval History magazine, which is done by the Naval Institute. And Mike Winger has a number of books and articles out. So those are some of the preeminent Pearl Harbor experts you can check out.
Okay, the last question for today will be, what happened to the USS Vestal?
That's a good question. I know what happened to her immediately. She served throughout the Pacific and also, I believe, in the European theater. So she did survive, but actually what her plight, I'd have to look that up. So, she did manage to get to IS Shoals that day, run herself aground, and being a repair ship, she was back up and running the next day after extensive repairs to the bomb that went out the bottom of her hull. But yeah, the USS Vestal is one of those ships as a repair ship that has a great history. If you want immediate results, just Google the Vestal, and you'll probably come up with the U.S. Navy Heritage Command. They have a wonderful website that has the history of all the warships, and not only in the World War II, but in the history of the Navy.
Actually, there's only one more question. So
okay, well, we got one more.
Okay. Have we seen everything in terms of pictures or documents about the Arizona's work done in shipyard during the 1938 to 41 pre-war period?
I don't think so, because the National Archives hold secrets, and those secrets are that from time to time the National Archives, whether it be in Washington, D.C., or the National Archives, as you have in San Bruno, they have papers that in some cases haven't been not declassified, but just simply opened. And so they have a number of the salvage records at San Bruno. They also have them at the National Archives, too, in Maryland. So all of us that do research are always surprised that we find something that we didn't know was there. And I don't think there's any final word on research on that ship at all. We have not seen it all. We've seen a lot of it, but there's more to be found. Oh, and one of the things, this book is the official history of this site. It's called Remembering Pearl Harbor. It talks about the building of the memorial. It talks about the Navy's first stewardship of taking people to the memorial and the bringing of the National Park Service here in 1980, and how this history unfolded as we expanded a brand new visitor center in 1980. We would build another new one in 2010. All of that history's there. It's all done by Mike Slackman, so it's one of the best books you can get. And if you purchase this book for $10, and we'll tell you where you can get that, I will autograph that because I wrote the new introduction for it. But I think this should be in your library, and if you're interested in Pearl Harbor, you got to have this one. Okay, and then we have this is just coming up. This is a new film called Journey to the USS Arizona, and it's the history of the interment of Seaman Harry and his return to the USS Arizona. It is something, I just saw it the other night, and it's about all of us that are involved in the preparation of the interment, from the Navy to the Park Service personnel, how an interment is done, and how this one family, for the first time in history, the grandchildren came with the great-grandchildren to bring their grandfather back to the ship. So yeah, this is a good one, and have your Kleenex ready, because I'm about ready to get mine. Well, thank you, and aloha from Hawaii, and thank you for all your great questions. Good to hear from the Strattons and everybody else, and we'll have another one in 2 months, and we'll have a new topic out there that we can talk about, because there's the Pearl Harbor, as the lawyer for Admiral Kimmel once said, Pearl Harbor never dies, nor should it.